Picture this for a second. A dying teenager with hands so ravaged by disease he can barely hold a sword, leading just 500 knights against 26,000 of the most elite warriors the medieval world had ever seen. We're talking about odds of 52 to 1, the kind of numbers that don't just spell defeat, they spell total annihilation. This isn't some Hollywood fantasy or exaggerated legend passed down through the ages. This actually happened on November 25, 1177, and by the time the sun set that day, the most powerful Muslim army on the planet lay completely shattered across the desert floor. Here's the thing that blows my mind every time I dive into this story. This wasn't some seasoned general with decades of experience. This was Baldwin IV, a 16-year-old kid with advanced leprosy, a disease that medieval society viewed as divine punishment, literally strapped to his saddle because his legs couldn't grip his horse anymore. His face hidden behind a silver mask, his hands wrapped in silk bandages, and yet this dying boy was about to pull off what military historians still call the most statistically impossible victory in recorded history. So, why does this battle matter right now, in 2025? Because we're living in a time where everyone's obsessed with odds and algorithms, where we've been trained to think that if the numbers don't add up, you might as well quit before you start. We see this everywhere. Startups that never launch because the market share looks impossible. People who don't chase their dreams because the statistics say most fail. Entire generations convinced that if you're not the biggest player in the room, you've already lost. The Battle of Montgisard is the ultimate middle finger to that mentality. Let me set the stage for you. The year 1177 was basically the endgame for Christian kingdoms in the Holy Land, like the final season of a show where all your favorite characters are about to get killed off. For nearly 80 years, Crusader knights had been holding on to these fortress cities in what's now Israel and Palestine, but the golden age was over. The Islamic world had found its champion, a military genius named Saladin, who'd been systematically destroying every Christian army sent against him. We're talking about a guy who controlled territory from Egypt all the way to Syria, who commanded over 100,000 warriors, whose reputation alone made castle defenders surrender without a fight, and who stood in his way? A teenage leper king whose own body was actively trying to kill him. Baldwin IV had been diagnosed with leprosy at age 9, crowned at 13, and by 16, his condition had progressed to the point where court physicians were amazed he could even sit upright. His hands were losing fingers. His face was deteriorating beneath that silver mask, and the pain, according to the chronicles, was beyond what most men could endure for even a day. Yet somehow this kid was running a kingdom while Saladin, at the height of his power and in perfect health, was preparing to deliver the knockout punch. The power imbalance was so ridiculous, it's almost funny, except it wasn't funny to the people living through it. The Crusader states could maybe scrape together 15,000 men total if they emptied every castle and city, and those troops were scattered across hundreds of miles. Saladin rolled up with armies that outnumbered them 10 to 1, backed by the wealth of Egypt, which at the time was basically printing money. Smart money, and I mean everyone from merchants to nobles to the Pope himself, figured Jerusalem had maybe weeks before the walls came crashing down. Ships were literally waiting in the ports to evacuate refugees. Secret treaties were being negotiated. This wasn't a question of if the kingdom would fall, but how quickly and how much blood would be spilled in the process. But here's where things get absolutely wild, and I need you to really think about this, because it sets up everything that follows. How does a 16-year-old with advanced leprosy, a disease that literally eats away your nerve endings so you can't even feel pain anymore, which sounds like an advantage until you realize it means you're constantly damaging yourself without knowing it? How does this kid not only hold a sword, but lead a cavalry charge? Like, we're not talking about sitting in a throne room giving orders. We're talking about physically fighting in medieval combat, which required insane grip strength, coordination, and stamina. According to medical experts who've studied the historical descriptions of Baldwin's condition, his hands by age 16 would have been partially paralyzed, missing fingers, with muscle atrophy making it nearly impossible to close his fist around anything. Yet every single chronicle, Christian and Muslim alike, describes him raising his sword on that battlefield. Some kind of mental willpower that modern science still can't fully explain? Divine intervention, as the religious sources claimed? Or was there some technique, some way the Templars had adapted his armor and weapons that history forgot to record? And here's another mystery that'll keep you up at night. Saladin, this military genius who'd been studying warfare since childhood, who'd won every major battle of his career, somehow made a tactical error so catastrophic that it cost him 90% of his army in a single afternoon. What was it? The chronicles hint at overconfidence, at Saladin dismissing reports of Baldwin's approach because the numbers seem too ridiculous to take seriously. But there's got to be more to it. Professional commanders don't just scatter 26,000 warriors across miles of open terrain without proper reconnaissance, without maintaining formation discipline. Something happened in Saladin's decision-making process that day, some psychological blind spot, and figuring out what it was might be the key to understanding the whole battle. Then there's this detail that the histories gloss over, but is absolutely crucial. How did Baldwin's force march 45 miles in 36 hours? That's nearly 50 miles of rough terrain in a day and a half, which would exhaust even modern soldiers with proper logistics and support. These were medieval knights in full armor, their horses already worn down from constant campaigning, and they supposedly covered this distance fast enough to catch Saladin's scouts completely off guard. Templars taking turns carrying Baldwin's litter when he passed out from pain, the entire army functioning on maybe 3 hours of sleep total. And yet when they hit the battlefield, they fought like fresh troops on energy drinks. Muslim chroniclers added another layer of mystery when they called this battle divine punishment. Now, medieval writers threw around religious language all the time, but these particular sources were talking about guys like Ibn al-Athir, who were generally pretty rational in their military analysis. They couldn't explain what happened any other way. They described Muslim cavalry warriors, Mamluks who'd been trained from childhood and never knew defeat, literally freezing when they saw Baldwin's charge. Not retreating tactically, not being outmaneuvered, but psychologically breaking before the fighting even really started. What causes that? What makes veteran soldiers look at 500 charging knights and decide, despite outnumbering them 52-1, that they're about to die? Alright, here's what actually went down, and trust me, the reality is somehow crazier than any legend. On November 23, 1177, Saladin made his move. He bypassed the fortress of Ascalon, figuring why waste time on siege warfare when Jerusalem itself was sitting there like a ripe fruit ready to fall. His 26,000 mounted warriors spread out across the countryside. Discipline went slack, foraging parties scattered in every direction. This was an army that had already won in their minds, soldiers literally dividing up the loot before the looting even started. Meanwhile, Baldwin received intelligence reports and made a decision that his entire war council called suicide. Instead of waiting behind Jerusalem's walls, instead of playing defense and hoping for reinforcements that would never come, he decided to attack. Not just sortie out and harass the enemy, but actually seek out Saladin's main army and engage in open battle with odds of 52-1 against him. His advisors, hardened crusaders who'd seen decades of warfare, begged him to reconsider. But Baldwin, carried into the war council on a litter because walking had become impossible, said something that made grown men weep. He told them, "I may die tomorrow or in 10 years, but I will die defending this kingdom, not hiding behind walls while it burns." So they marched. 500 knights, including 80 Templar warrior monks who'd taken literal vows to never retreat, backed by about 3,000 infantry who had more courage than training. They covered 45 miles in 36 hours, which meant sleeping maybe 3 hours total, eating in the saddle, Templars rotating carrying duty when Baldwin lost consciousness from the sheer agony his body was putting him through. By the morning of November 25th, they'd somehow, impossibly, positioned themselves between Saladin's scattered army and Jerusalem. Here's where Baldwin's tactical genius comes into play. His scouts reported that Saladin's force wasn't just large. It was spread across 3 miles of open terrain, totally relaxed, guards down. The Sultan himself was so confident he set up his command tent in the middle of his camp, not even bothering with defensive positions. And Baldwin saw something that Saladin's experience had blinded him to: the terrain. What looked like perfect cavalry country from a distance was actually cut through with a series of ravines, natural features that would funnel any retreat into death traps. If he could just break their morale, just cause enough chaos to start a rout, those ravines would do the rest of the work. At 11 a.m., Saladin got his first warning. Dust clouds to the north, moving fast. According to the chronicles, his initial reaction was literally disbelief, like the reports made no logical sense. Baldwin wouldn't dare leave Jerusalem's walls. It had to be a scouting party. But by noon, Crusader banners appeared on the ridge line, that blood-red Templar cross that Muslims had learned to fear, the golden crosses of Jerusalem. Saladin's scattered forces started frantically trying to reform their lines. But here's the thing. 3 miles is a long distance when your enemy's already charging at full gallop. Military logic, everything written in every tactical manual of the era, said Baldwin should wait. Let Saladin organize, and retreat to defensible ground and force a siege. Instead, at exactly 2 p.m., the leper king raised his bandaged hand, a signal his knights had been simultaneously dreading and praying for. 500 lances dropped to charging position. The most statistically impossible attack in military history had begun, and Saladin, the greatest Muslim commander of his generation, was about to learn that sometimes numbers mean absolutely nothing. Now here's the twist that changes everything we thought we knew about this battle. See, conventional wisdom, both at the time and now, focuses on Baldwin's courage and faith, the whole David versus Goliath angle. And yeah, that's part of it. But there's something way more calculated going on, something that reveals Baldwin wasn't just brave, he was scary smart in a way that most historians completely miss. Remember those ravines I mentioned? Baldwin didn't just notice them by accident. According to a recent analysis of medieval Arabic sources that most Western historians overlooked, Baldwin had been studying reports of Saladin's movements for weeks. He'd been waiting, letting his enemy get overconfident, deliberately not engaging, even when he had smaller opportunities. He was setting up the perfect conditions, terrain he knew, an enemy that was scattered and cocky, timing that would put the sun at his back during the charge. This wasn't desperate faith. This was chess played at the highest level by a teenager whose body was falling apart. But here's what really gets me: the emotional weight of what Baldwin did to his own men. Think about this from a knight's perspective. You've just force-marched through hell, you're exhausted, and now your dying king is telling you to charge into an army that outnumbers you more than 50 to 1. The Templars, warrior monks who'd vowed to never retreat, reportedly wept when Baldwin was lifted onto his horse and strapped to the saddle because his legs couldn't grip anymore. They knew they were riding to their deaths, and their leader, who should have been in bed receiving last rites, was suffering worse than any of them, and still leading from the front. The physical effort of just sitting upright in the saddle had reopened wounds all over his body. The pain must have been absolutely unimaginable, the kind of agony that should have made rational thought impossible. Yet he wasn't just present, he was actively commanding, directing the attack with tactical precision that would make modern military officers jealous. How do you process that level of willpower? What does it do to your own courage when you see your teenage king, who can't feel his hands anymore, who's literally crying tears of blood behind a silver mask, charging ahead of you into certain death? And then there's Saladin's perspective, which the Muslim sources provide in heartbreaking detail. Here's a man who'd built his entire reputation on never losing, who'd united Egypt and Syria through military genius and genuine piety. He wasn't some bloodthirsty conqueror. By all accounts, Saladin was deeply religious, treated prisoners well, respected worthy enemies. And on that day, he watched his carefully built army, the culmination of years of planning and political maneuvering, just disintegrate. At 3 p.m., his personal guard, 2,000 Mamluks who'd sworn blood oaths to die before abandoning him, broke and ran. The chronicles record that Saladin, desperate to escape, abandoned his warhorse too slow and mounted a racing camel. Think about what that image means. The Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the sword of Islam, fleeing the battlefield on a pack animal while his army died around him. The humiliation, the psychological trauma of watching everything you built collapse in 3 hours, knowing that future generations would read about how you ran away on a camel while a dying 16-year-old stood his ground. Saladin lived another 16 years, won many battles, eventually reconquered Jerusalem, but according to sources close to him, he never fully recovered from Montgisard. He approached every subsequent battle with the Crusaders with a caution that bordered on paranoia, always fearing that somehow, impossibly, it could happen again. But here's the final twist that makes this whole story almost unbearably tragic. Baldwin won the battle, but lost the war in the slowest, cruelest way possible. He'd bought his kingdom 10 years with that victory, proven that faith and tactics could overcome impossible odds, became a legend to both his followers and his enemies. But his body? His body was done. The effort of that battle accelerated his disease catastrophically. By age 20, he was blind. By 22, he couldn't walk at all. By 24, he was dead. And just 2 years after that, without his leadership, Saladin took Jerusalem anyway. Everything Baldwin had fought for, every ounce of pain he'd endured, bought his people 1 decade before the inevitable. Was it worth it? Did those 10 years of survival justify what he put himself through? That's a question that's haunted historians for 850 years. So here's what I need you to think about, and I mean really think about, because this goes way beyond some medieval battle. When Baldwin raised his bandaged hand and signaled that charge, he knew, had to know based on every military precedent, that he was probably going to die in the next hour. His knights knew it. His advisors knew it. Even his enemies, when they figured out what was happening, assumed they were witnessing a suicide attack by religious fanatics who'd lost their minds. But what if Baldwin knew something we've forgotten in our modern world of algorithms and probability calculations and playing it safe? What if he understood that sometimes, maybe the most important times, the numbers don't matter at all? That there's a factor in human conflict, in any situation where people face impossible odds that can't be calculated or predicted. Call it faith, call it morale, call it the psychological impact of seeing someone who should be dead leading from the front. Whatever you call it, it's real, and it changed history. Here's my question for you, and I genuinely want you to think about this. In your own life right now, what's your 26,000 to 500 moment? What impossible thing have you decided not to even attempt because the odds look ridiculous? Maybe it's starting that business when you're broke. Maybe it's making a career change when everyone says you're too old. Maybe it's standing up for something you believe in when the entire culture seems lined up against you. We've been trained by society to look at the statistics, calculate our chances, and play it safe when the numbers don't add up. But Baldwin didn't have that luxury. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made him great. When you're dying anyway, when you've got nothing to lose and everything to fight for, the risk calculation changes completely. The question isn't, can I win? Because the answer to that is obviously no. The question becomes, what's worth dying for? And once you answer that, once you really commit to something bigger than self-preservation, you become the kind of person who makes 26,000 warriors run away. Now here's the part that should keep you up tonight. Both Christian and Muslim sources, historians who disagreed on literally everything else, agreed that something supernatural happened at Montgisard. How else do you explain exhausted horses outrunning fresh ones? How do 500 men not just survive, but completely annihilate 26,000? How does a teenager whose body was falling apart outmaneuver the greatest military commander of his era? You can call it God, you can call it psychology, you can call it a statistical fluke that'll never happen again. But you can't deny it happened. So what does that mean for impossible things in general? If one dying teenager with 500 knights can do the mathematically impossible, what does that say about the limits we accept in our own lives? What could you accomplish if you stopped calculating odds and started asking what is worth fighting for, regardless of whether you think you can win? And here's the final cliffhanger I'll leave you with, something the chronicles mention, but never fully explain. After the battle, when Baldwin was finally lifted from his saddle and collapsed, barely conscious from pain and blood loss, witnesses reported he said something to his knights. The exact words were lost, or maybe deliberately not recorded, but the effect was immediate. Battle-hardened Templars, men who just spent 3 hours slaughtering thousands, reportedly broke down sobbing. What did Baldwin say? What final wisdom did the leper king share in his moment of triumph that moved men who thought they'd seen everything? We'll never know for sure, but I've got a theory based on piecing together fragments from different sources. I think Baldwin told them the truth that he'd known all along: this victory would cost him everything, that the physical toll of leading that charge would rob him of his remaining years, that he traded his future for theirs. And I think he told them it was worth it, that some things matter more than living a long life. That 10 more years for his kingdom, 10 more years for the families and children behind Jerusalem's walls, was worth whatever time he had left. The question is, what would you trade for your impossible victory? What's your Montgisard? And more importantly, when the moment comes, when the odds are 52-1 against you, and everyone's telling you to quit, will you have the courage to raise your hand and charge anyway? Because according to history, just once in a while, the impossible actually happens. But only for people crazy enough, faithful enough, desperate enough to try. Think about that.